Jesus, son, do you really want to bring her into our house? Nancy was indignant when she saw Molly for the first time. She's a farm girl, a redneck. There's only one thing on her mind: how to jump into bed with a rich man and in Moscow to settle down. I won't let my son go to the world. There was no wedding when James brought his bride into the house. The mother was slightly perplexed. She genuinely didn't understand why he had chosen her. Molly was quite a pretty girl, also very often liked by men, but she was not suitable for the role of a wife, and Nancy clearly understood it. We're going out with my father. We won't say a word to you, but marry, she said after James had sent Molly home in a cab. You're still very young. You can't even think about getting married yet. You haven't even gotten an education yet, much less James. But who to marry? Look who you've chosen. It's just awful. What could you possibly have in common with her? Plebeians and commoners? You'll hate her in a year because you won't even have anything to talk about. Stupid as a country cork. Where are you going with this? Okay, you're not thinking about your father and me. At least think about yourself. It's about your future. Think about what's in store for you with her. Nancy was never shy when it came to Molly, which certainly made James angry. But he couldn't afford to be rude to his mother, because he was too well-mannered. No matter how much he was hurt by her words, he tried to keep his emotions in check. She hated Molly just because the girl didn't belong in their circle, which was formed solely in their own heads. James had always thought that was wrong. He was convinced that it didn't matter where a person was born or who he was brought up by. What mattered was how he grew up and what he did as an adult. But Nancy never shared her son's views. The woman was sure that the family and the environment in which a person was brought up determines all his future destiny. Remember, son, it is Seneca is not born songs, she admonished. This, according to the laws of nature, is impossible. In the same way, a plebeian can never become a decent person. She will forever remain as she is, and there's nothing you can do about it. Mother had her own idea of dignity, which James never shared either. She focused solely on herself, her own and her father's upbringing. Look what a good couple Charles and I make, she said every time her son talked about getting married. You know why we're still together? Because we're from the same circle. We always have something to talk about. We fit each other intellectually first and foremost. That's the most important thing. If you marry a fool, you'll spend the rest of your life running around. A good bed, you know, son, is no indicator of a relationship. No, it's the most important thing. You're just young, and you don't realize it. When you're older, you realize you made a bad choice that you'll have to pay for the rest of your life. Nancy and Charles were hereditary intellectuals. They were brought up in good families and studied at the same institute. All their lives, they had been interested exclusively in science. Their family was more of a profitable union than a marriage of mutual pure love. Nancy could not imagine marrying a man outside her circle. Her parents, too, insisted that their daughter be choosy and pay attention exclusively to those young men who were entirely up to her level. And since she never had an attractive appearance and was more like a nerdy girl than one capable of attracting anyone's attention, she had no choice. When she met Charles and realized that in the future he would not mind tying his fate with her. We're dead set on it. That's right, daughter, Kelly said. Nancy's mom. I was the same way when I met your father. Men are like that. They need to be poured out first. But that's what they do with the lower class girls. And then they're ready to get married? Take your time. He's not pushing him. Believe me, he can't find a better wife than you. And he's a young man from a decent family. That's why he won't take just anyone as a wife. He only wants shit. And who else would he want if not you? And she was right. Charles didn't just get involved with a modest girl from his department. At the first courses, he considered Nancy as a future party And outside the walls of the institute, he regularly met beautiful girls, but not from intelligent families. They were less of a problem, too, because they were unrestricted. They saw nothing special in meeting a young man for a few months, and then break up and do not even remember about him. Young, green. They all wanted to have fun and live life to the fullest. Nancy, on the other hand, spent all day and night studying. Even on weekends, she rarely left the house, because she always had something to do. From time to time, James would take her for romantic, unobtrusive walks, and then walk her home. He was never attracted to her outwardly, but there was always something to talk about. They discussed studies, science, books. Nancy was a very multifaceted and well-rounded person, and that was what attracted Charles to her. Son, don't marry early. His father nodded at the young man. I myself got married only at the age of 25. Before that, you still need to walk around, or you'll be hiding from your wife later. And it is not so easy. Looking at his son, Stephen remembered his youth. He was just like Charles, who wanted to live life to the fullest and not be responsible for anything. So accepted his reluctance to commit himself to marriage early. When Charles brought Nancy to meet his parents, they approved of his choice. Beautiful girl, Cindy enthused. His mother couldn't have wished for a better bride for her son. Charles was convinced that he had made the right choice. He had had many girls before he married, but none of them could claim to be the mistress of his house. His parents would never in their lives approve of marrying a girl who didn't meet their expectations. And that meant he would have to make his own way into the big sciences. And he did not want that, because it is always easier to take advantage of patronage than to do something himself. He understood this clearly and always tried not to contradict his father or mother, who were ready to help him in finding a job and building a career. Nancy, on the other hand, had time for absolutely everything. She was the kind of person who was used to doing everything clearly and smoothly. And for her, there was no fatigue after work. She would come and immediately get up to the stove to prepare dinner for her beloved husband. When a son was born, Cindy began to admire her daughter-in-law even more. Imagine that, she exclaimed, holding little James in her arms. What a good girl. She's given us an heir. James was born a year after the wedding. Charles didn't want the baby to come so soon, but he kept it from his wife. What can I say? He thought to himself, fearfully contemplating how he would sit in the evenings over the next scientific paper, listening to the cries in the next room. In the first 3 years of his son's life, he had never once come near the child. The entire care of a boy fell on the shoulders of Nancy, who had to temporarily leave scientific work. Helped with the child and grandmothers, but they were only happy to these worries. Stephen understood his son. If you want, you can come and live with us, he said a few months after the boy's birth. Or to the country. I know what sleepless nights are like and how they negatively affect productivity. I used to go to work with a square head myself when you were born. What can you do? I had to. But you're a man. You're no better than a nanny. So if you know it's too hard for you, come here. I'll tell Cindy to stay in your apartment for a while. She's hardly working now anyway. She only goes to see Nancy regularly. Charles gladly accepted his father's offer, and a few days after this conversation, he packed his things. His mother looked at him askew, but did not show her displeasure. She understood why her son so abruptly wanted to leave his home and move to his parents' apartment. But Nancy was very much offended by her husband's deed. Well, you understand, it's impossible to work quietly. He justified himself to his wife. She is always crying, shouting. And I have to look into everything. I can't afford to be wrong. What kind of a scientist am I then? Nancy, you'll have to be patient for a while. I'll come and visit you in my spare time. When James is older, we'll live together like we used to. But Charles had very little free time. He tried to work so hard that his parents could see he was doing his best for the family. He had no tame. All that diapering and cradling just wasn't for him. His wife forgave him because she had nothing else to do. Nancy was always humble, submissive, and would not allow the thought of divorce. She believed that a family is created once and for a lifetime, and that was the only way a person could be happy. Her happiness consisted in having a friendly atmosphere in the house. Her husband and son were happy, and her husband's parents had no complaints against her. You, most importantly, behaved properly with him, always advised Nancy's mother to smooth out sharp corners. Not to argue, will not cross. I have you. You, of course, a girl, very smart, but you yourself realize that intelligence is not the main thing. And God has dealt you a bad hand with your looks. So it's unlikely you'll ever find another husband. Family happiness is the most important
thing for a woman. You can't get anywhere without it. Whatever career you build, how many won't achieve it? And if you don't have a husband and children, your life will be empty and meaningless. Nancy had been listening to the advice of her mother, who raised her alone since she was a teenager. Kelly's husband passed away in a car accident when Nancy was only 5 years old. She never remembered her father. Here was a mother who never managed to marry again. She devoted her entire life to working at the university and raising her daughter. Every spare minute she spent next to Nancy on the mustache, nodding at her to do well in her studies.
You, my girl, must understand that the beautiful are allowed everything. They may not study, they may not work, and then they may marry well and get all that they want out of this life with you. Yes, as a matter of fact, so can I. It's a completely different story. We can't afford that. And to marry anyone more or less worthy, we must have considerable intelligence and talent. Then there's at least a chance that someone will pay attention to you. Otherwise, you'll spend your whole life forging your own. And that's something you wouldn't wish on an enemy. Charles was a light in the window for Nancy, and when her son started to grow up, she tried hard to make him believe that he was allowed to do anything. Are you lucky? A mother told her 16-year-old son. You were born not just in a decent, well-to-do family, but in a family where you are the only son, which means your opinion is law. Your father and I will always be on your side, no matter what you decide. You should know that. Years later, when James met his one true love, he'll remind his mother of those words, but she'll brush them off. All he'll say is that she didn't mean it at all. He met Molly by chance and considered it a gift from fate, and she was sitting in a cafe and drinking coffee. She had such a pensive look that it was impossible not to pay attention to her. "Excuse me, may I sit down?" a young man asked politely, approaching her table. James had always been so shy that he never dared to just walk up and meet a girl he liked. Even at the institute, he behaved so modestly that his classmates were always surprised by it. James, you will never glue anyone together like that." Student friends laughed when they all gathered together. In the smoking room on break, sometimes he was uncomfortable discussing with them another stormy night spent with girls of dubious reputation and smelling the tart tobacco smoke that made him dizzy. At such times, he kept up a conversation out of politeness and left at the first opportunity. His friends noticed this, but never asked specific questions. They always only teased James, but he was not offended by them, as he understood that they were united only by their studies. When they get their diplomas, they will separate forever. And it was unlikely they would ever meet again. When Molly heard the young man's voice, she looked up in surprise and asked, "Aren't there any other tables here?" "I think the cafe is a big place. There's enough for everyone." But hearing these words, James did not retreat. He looked at the girl carefully and continued the conversation. "Yes, you're right," he said. "But I'd really like to have coffee with you." I hope you won't mind." Molly scrutinized the young man from head to toe. He was good-looking, but that was not what caught her attention. She paid attention to the expensive phone of the latest model, branded shoes and things. For about 2 minutes, they looked at each other in silence. Then Molly nodded approvingly, inviting James to sit down at her table. They talked for several hours and didn't even notice how the time flew by. "That's it. I've got to go," she said. "It was nice to meet you." "Wait, let me walk you out." James didn't want to leave Molly. He couldn't just let her go. The young man was surprised at his own determination. Until now, it was hard to imagine that he could be so stubborn and persistent. "You don't have to see me off. I'm on my way to meet a friend, so I'm sorry, I don't want to be late." "Then leave your phone number," he asked. "I promise I won't call you for any nonsense, but I just don't want to lose you. The girl immediately took the hint and dictated the number and left the cafe. It happened so quickly that James did not even have time to make a call. What if she tricked me? It went through his head. To make sure he was wrong, James immediately checked the girl's phone number on messengers and, after making sure she was registered with several of them, drove home quietly. She hadn't gotten out of his head, and never before had he experienced such strong feelings. He had fallen in love only a few times in his short life, but because he was too modest and shy to show his feelings. When he met Molly, he realized that he had behaved wrongly before and started to take initiative. He regularly asked her out on a date, and she gladly agreed to spend time with him. A few months after their acquaintance, Molly became a frequent guest in their house. Nancy didn't like it, so when Molly came over, she wouldn't leave her room. Charles, on the contrary, was happy for his son, but did not miss the opportunity to tell him that to marry is not only too early, but also has no sense. "But what were you doing getting married?" "A wedding," he said. "Are you sleeping with her? Sleeping with her? What else do you want? All those moonlit walks, beautiful words, ceremonies, all this is long gone. It's a different time. And it's not just that. And before, men used to fulfill all these attributes and incarnate behind women for years, just for one thing, which they did not allow to do to themselves before marriage. And now it's all lost its meaning. Dating, I don't see the problem. Go, you'll find yourself a decent wife from our circle. Believe me, your mother is absolutely right, and she doesn't advise you to do anything wrong." James found his father's cynicism hard to take and never thought he would hear him say such words. He had always thought of his family as exemplary. It seemed to him that his parents had married for love and still had mutual feelings for each other. But after talking to them, he became more and more convinced that Charles was a big egoist. His love for his mother also caused doubts. Maybe, in fact, he married her only for profit, because she is his circle, and in fact, never loved her. From time to time, such thoughts ran through James's head, but he chased them away. The young man didn't want to think about his parents like that, and their personal life didn't concern him at all. But to Molly, he felt his whole soul, and after hearing her story, he loved her even more. How did it happen? He was surprised when she told him about her life. He waited a long time for this confidential conversation, because Molly did not hurry to share with him the most intimate things. And Wisseroff, when finally they were able to have a heart-to-heart talk, James realized why she was so withdrawn and closed. It was the kind of childhood no one could wish for. She was completely innocent. Molly's father drank a lot. She barely remembered him. Sometimes the most terrible fragments of her childhood came to mind as he took her mother by the hair and threw her on the floor. About half an hour later, the police and ambulance burst into the apartment, and she was sitting behind the sofa. The battered father bent over his mother's breathless body, not even realizing what he had done. He was taken away immediately. 2 years later, he died in prison. And all of this time, Molly spent in an orphanage, where she was sent immediately after her mother's funeral because her grandmother failed to get custody. Miranda spent 5 years going through the courts. She was only able to get custody when Molly was a teenager. "Well, you'll have to forgive the girl somehow," said the stern, full-figured woman with glasses as she filled out the paperwork. "She's 15 years old now. I'm sure nothing will happen to you in that time." Miranda realized that Molly had been given to her only to avoid giving her an apartment. After she was released from the orphanage, the guardianship had no good intentions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have crippled the child's mental life for so many years, but would have allowed the guardianship to be finalized immediately after the mother's death. Molly wasn't too happy with this decision either.
On the one hand, she was glad that she would live next to her grandmother, who loved her very much. But on the other hand, the girl realized that after receiving Miranda's guardianship, she lost any chance for a free and independent life. She will not get an apartment, which means that she will have to be satisfied with a room in the apartment of her grandmother, who closely followed the girl's hobbies, trying to make up for the lack of education and upbringing. Generalization from the orphanage. With such friends, Molly also had to forget. For a full 3 years, they resumed communication only after that they became adults. You shouldn't be hanging out with them. So you've got a lot on your plate. No upbringing. No education at all. I don't know how you're going to get on with your life. Miranda regularly reprimanded Molly, which the girl really didn't like.
Over time, she realized that she felt much better in the orphanage than in her family. At least she had more freedom, which she had been deprived of immediately after moving to her grandmother's house. "I'm going to Moscow," Molly said when she turned 18. "I'll earn money and go. There, the wages are good. I'll rent a place to live. It's not like being stuck in our backwoods all my life. What are the prospects here?" Hearing such a statement from her granddaughter, Miranda was shocked. She was categorically against such a decision. What Moscow is? "Moscow to you?" she asked her harshly. "Who needs you there? You know how many wonderful newcomers there are like you. You'll be run over there. You won't even have time to blink an eye. You won't go anywhere. There's enough people there without you. Moscow is not rubber." But Molly was not interested in her grandmother's opinion. In a week, she got a job as a sales clerk in one of the local clothing stores and started saving money to move to Moscow. 6 months later, Dents. And she managed to save up the necessary amount, after which she put her grandmother before the fact. "In 2 days I'm leaving," she said. "I've already packed my things. I have the money." Miranda didn't know what to say to that. Since Molly had gotten a job, they had grown apart. She guessed that her granddaughter spent her time not only in the store, but she didn't want to think badly of her. The girl often didn't come home at night, and sometimes she could be gone for weeks. At first, Miranda asked where she was spending her time, but when she got tired of listening to the answer, frank rudeness, stopped being interested in the life of her granddaughter. Since Molly's departure to Moscow, she has never called her grandmother. Miranda was offended by her granddaughter, but then realized that it was useless to establish relations with her. She suddenly realized that too much water had passed. The woman realized that Molly was very much offended by her, and for the orphanage, and for life with her father and mother, who should have been deprived of parental rights before the tragedy occurred. One day, Molly had even blurted out in her heart that it would be better if you had talked her into canceling the orphanage. "I wish I hadn't existed at all." Miranda felt guilty before her granddaughter, whom she had not been able to keep either from her tyrant, alcoholic father. No, a weak, free-spirited mother has no life in an orphanage. When she thought of all this, she became very painful. When Molly called, the woman herself was overjoyed. "Grandma, I'm getting married," said the girl whose voice Miranda had not heard for more than half a year. "I'm inviting you to the wedding. I'll send you the money for the ticket. I hope you will come." Miranda was immensely happy. She had always wished Molly well and wanted her life to be different from her mother's. The woman didn't ask about her fiancé over the phone. She decided it was for the best. Miranda was very afraid of making Molly angry. If she had made up her mind, she shouldn't have thrown anything away from her. A month later, the woman flew to Moscow and was amazed at the scale of the celebration. "I've already introduced you," Molly said, wearing a luxurious white dress that had been customized. "What are you standing there for?" "James and I are husband and wife now." "Aren't you happy for us?" Immediately after the registration, they went to a fancy restaurant where a huge number of guests had gathered. Miranda felt very uncomfortable in such a place. In her whole life, she had never been even in a cafe. To visit such a posh establishment was out of the question. At one time, her wedding was held very modestly, poorly. The husband turned out to be just like his father, drinking, weakly ill, without character. With every year of their life together, he was going downhill more and more rapidly. She was afraid even to admit to herself that she wanted him dead more than anything else in the world. She could not divorce, kept a common residence. Yes, and then it was not customary to first run to the registry office and then dissolve the marriage, socially condemned. She lived like that for 14 years until her boyfriend died of a heart attack. After another binge, her daughter looked at all this, and there was simply no other life waiting for her. Because of this, Miranda always felt both guilt and responsibility. She was sure that she was to blame for all the troubles of her family, because she herself, all her life, showed a bad example, living under the same roof with an alcoholic and a debauchee. But the woman could not correct her mistakes, and this gave her a special, incomparable moral suffering, which could only be understood by a person who was in the same situation as herself. "Of course, she is very happy for you, my girl," said Miranda, hugging Molly. She had never been so calm for her before. She liked James immediately. Miranda realized that he was a very decent and responsible man, and Molly would be like a stone wall around him. Finally, she could stop worrying about her granddaughter. At the time, it seemed that way to her and herself. She didn't even realize it was just an illusion. "Maybe you'll come and live with us?" Molly asked. "James doesn't mind. We're his parents and it's a big apartment. We'll live with them for now." Then they promised to buy us a separate one. "But that'll be later, when James gets his degree." "No, Molly, I'm not going to make you feel uncomfortable." "It's not very comfortable," Miranda replied. "Besides, I've seen that James's parents aren't even thrilled to have me at the wedding. So living together on their property is out of the question." She immediately realized that Nancy didn't approve of her son's choice. As soon as Miranda crossed the threshold of the registry office where she arrived with Molly, she heard the woman whispering in her husband's ear. "Well, here come the relatives. Another hillbilly with no family." She didn't even realize how loudly she'd said it. The guests standing nearby looked disapprovingly in her direction, and Nancy has been wishing Miranda with her eyes all evening. So what if she wasn't happy? "What's there to be upset about now?" Molly said calmly to her grandmother. "It's nothing they've already told about me. Whatever that they thought, he doesn't care. The most important thing is that he and I love each other, and we are happy. He hasn't been paying attention to her parents for a long time. He's not a little boy, clinging to his mother's skirt, with some support from his father." James had really stopped paying any attention to his mother's sarcastic remarks. He tried not to discuss Molly, or anything to do with her. "I'm getting married, and it's a done deal," James told his mother a few months before the wedding. "We've already applied for the registry office. My father's fine with my choice, and you'll have to accept it." So that's how the boys got together. "They are," Nancy replied angrily, and did not speak to either her husband or her son for several days. After that, she tried several times to talk to Charles about James's marriage, but the latter cut the conversation short every time. "Nancy, he is a grown man," replied the husband to his wife's invectives and claims. "Yes, I agree with you that he decided to get married a little early and that he didn't choose the right girl. But that's his life. Let him make his mistakes, and we'll help him correct them if necessary. Prohibitions won't solve anything. The more we opposite this marriage, the more he will insist on it. That is the law of life. I see you've become a philosopher, she said scornfully. You've become a philosopher, she said contemptuously.
You know everything. You think so sensibly about everything. I already feel superfluous in this family. She was resentful of both her husband and her son, but she really had no choice but to accept reality. At the wedding, she had behaved defiantly, which neither Charles nor James liked. You promised that they would move away from us, Nancy told her husband when the celebration was over, and they were home alone. Why don't you buy him an apartment now, instead of when he graduates and goes to work? How many more years will I have to wait until this redneck is out of my sight? No, Nancy, Charles replied firmly. They won't move anywhere. They'll live here. It's a big apartment, 6 rooms. There's plenty of room for everyone. Oh, you don't even have to cross her if you want to. But they live in their room and you live in yours. James goes to the institute every day. Molly seems to be planning to take a course, so she'll stay in her room all day and study. And you seem to have a research paper to write. You still haven't completely given up on your career. So it's okay. We're all seeing each other now. Nancy had to deal with it. On the day of the wedding, they arrived home earlier than Molly and James, who had decided to take a walk after the biggest day of their lives. The woman had immediately shut herself in her room, so as not to see them, joyous, happy, head for the bedroom, which she was loath to enter even to wipe the dust. Looking at the bed there, she imagined each time her son sleeping there with Molly. And the thought made her feel so disgusted that sometimes she felt a rush of nausea. Yep. Nancy, I take it you've decided that you're going to live in a separate room now? Charles asked his wife. Is it to immerse yourself in your work? You know, I've thought about it and decided that it would be better for you and me to live separately for the time being. She answered carelessly, If you don't mind, of course. Every day she found herself not wanting to sleep with her husband anymore, even though things rarely happened between them. Most of the time, he was reading a book before going to bed, a book he was completely absorbed in. She was watching TV with headphones on. Molly and James got home deep into the Crowver hour. They spent the rest of the day walking around town, riding the river streetcar, and discussing further plans for a happy life together. Dropping to the bed, James lay on the belly of his newfound wife. Listen, is he still moving? James asked quietly. I wouldn't mind if he pushed me with his little foot. Come on, what's moving? He's just a baby. It's only 2 months old. Molly answered and laughed. In a couple of months he will push you. Now, let's go to sleep. Today is such an extraordinary day. But to be honest, I'm so tired. Just before the wedding, James learned that Molly was expecting a baby. And the news turned his mind upside down. He'd never been happier than he was right now. And he had no idea that his fiancée was hiding something. And it's something so important that it's going to change not only his life, but the lives of his entire family. I know all about you, Nancy said when she came into the kitchen this morning and found Molly there. And you don't have to try and deny it. I'll tell James tonight, and he'll divorce you. The woman took the photos out of the envelope and spread them out on the table. Would you like to see a picture of yourself? She continued. Keep in mind that with me these tricks will not work. I didn't like you right away. James is a naive, simple guy from a good family. You probably had your eye on him too, didn't you? Molly sat at the table and was silent. She didn't know what to say to her mother-in-law. She took the photos in her hands and began to look at them carefully. They didn't show anything special. But Nancy was sure that these pictures would be enough for James to immediately file for divorce from his wife. She was wrong. Molly wasn't so simple. It wasn't easy for a girl of her age to compete with her grandfather. Even to the woman who hired a private investigator to find out the whole truth about her entrusted past and get compromising photos of her. It wasn't until they were both of legal age that she met her friend Mason. Until then, Miranda had not allowed Molly to even come close to the orphanage. She really wanted the girl to part with her homeless past forever, which was her fault. But no other measures but prohibitions had occurred to the woman, and that was utterly useless. Finally, out of this nightmare, joyfully said Mason, coming to meet Molly. You have to admit, it's nice to have modern technology. If it weren't for the internet, I might never have found you. They don't give you an address at the orphanage. I would have found you myself, Molly replied, taking the young man's hand. But what? At least you got an apartment. You won't believe it. Almost everyone got an apartment. Who didn't get a foster home? I got my own one-bedroom now. I'm finally living like a normal person. It's awesome. No foster parents, no probation officers. And no mom and dad standing over my head. The orphanage isn't as bad as it seems in the beginning. But you realize that as an adult. He was an orphan just like Molly. Parents who had done nothing but use and sell illegal substances their whole lives and were in jail. Grandparents who were rescued descended alcoholics who didn't even remember that they had a grandchild. When Mason's parents were disenfranchised, he was only 7 years old. The alarm was raised by neighbors who were fed up with the constant drug addicts who came to visit his parents, and then at night in the stairwell. Until the age of 7, Mason did not go to kindergarten and did not develop in any way. When he grew up and began to shrink under his parents' feet, they wanted to put him in an orphanage, but then changed their minds. After all, the kid could have been used for other things. No one would suspect him as young as 6 years old. They gave Mason small bags and told him which floors to place them on in the entryway, and he, not realizing what they were for, unquestioningly fulfilled the requests of his father and mother, who gave him something to eat for it. There were weeks when Mason was not fed at all. The money from the sale of substances was quickly running out, and it was not always possible to earn new ones quickly and safely. But Mason found a way out of such situations. Wandering through garbage dumps, collecting scraps and asking passersby to treat him to something. The boy, with sad but serious eyes, almost never refused. People could not remain indifferent when they saw him. So poor, miserable, shabby, and hungry. His childhood he remembered very poorly. Like Molly, his most poignant moments surfaced in his mind. How his mother had once overdosed, and his father had tried with all his might to pump out the woman lying on the floor with lice with his lips. He remembered how the ambulance arrived. And after his mother was taken to the hospital, his father took him in his arms and began to talk about how she had just gotten us back from this heat. At the time, he still didn't realize what was going on. His parents even cleaned the apartment and bought groceries to pretend they were a decent family. But it was all so long ago, and so untrue, that sometimes Mason felt as if this life hadn't happened to him, but to some other boy he'd read about in a book. When Molly was taken into the orphanage, he was the first person she met. Mason was never mean and was kind to his peers, so he didn't ignore the new girl either. It didn't take long for them to become friends. Same families, social situation, living conditions, dependent parents. They had a lot to talk about. He realized he was in love with Molly long before her grandmother took her in, and he longed for his militant friend from the orphanage. He was even afraid that they would never meet again. Miranda not only forbade Molly to visit her friends at the orphanage, but also to call or write to them. But Molly knew she would be sure to find Mason as soon as the opportunity presented itself. And so they stood together again, talking like old times, as if those long 3 years of separation had never happened. "I wish I could find a job," he said thoughtfully. "Only if it wasn't a regular schedule." "Pay okay. Where would you find such a thing?" she grinned. "This is not Moscow. Here, you know what salaries. You'll be saving for pantyhose for 2 months." As they walked home, Mason thought about her words. And when they got to his apartment, a thought struck him. "Listen, you know what I was thinking?" he said. "You're right about everything, huh?" "I'm right." Molly tried to make a serious face, but she failed. She went on, grinning and couldn't help it. She was so happy to see Mason that it was impossible to contain her emotions. "I'm Moscow. What if I rented out my apartment and moved there? Are you kidding me?" "For the money you'd rent an apartment here, at best, you'd buy a compartment ticket to Moscow. But in general, the idea is right. What if we do it differently?" It was then that an idea was born in her head that was going to change her life. At least, Molly wanted to believe that she could achieve her goals in a short period of time. "Find a husband in Moscow," she said. "Only a wealthy one. Just guys with no interest or some older guy to hook up with. Naturally, not for free. First I'll move in, then I'll drag you along, then I'll take him to the movies, and we'll get married. When we have enough money, of course." When he heard those words, Mason tensed. He tried hard to hide his discomfort, but he wasn't very good at it. "You look like you're about to throw up," Molly grinned. "It's like you were born yesterday and you don't know how. Come on, but no lyrics. We need to see which places in Moscow are the most expensive, where even a cup of coffee cannot afford to drink a mere mortal. Take us some food and raise some money, move in and hang out there all day long, see if anyone's been spiked. When you get there, I'll get you a room."
Why don't you get a job? Why not? There are plenty of jobs in Moscow. You can make a career out of it and not depend on anyone. She came to see him almost every night.
Molly was seriously in love with Mason. He always knew she was the right person for him. Bold, open, cunning, and a rare beauty.
You couldn't miss a girl like that, even in a big crowd. And to live with her for several years under the same roof and remain indifferent was just stupid. "Did not change your mind?" he asked after 3 months. "Will not be disgusting?" "Funny," she replied. "Do not worry, it is. When I lie under it, I'll picture you." Calm down, Mason. Jealousy burned and he couldn't help it. His greatest fear was that Molly would actually fall in love with some major and leave him. When she called him a month after the move and happily informed him that he could pack his things, Mason couldn't believe it. "Are you telling me you've got it all worked out?" he asked. "Not exactly, but I found an opportunity for you to move. About the territories, for now. Anyway, come, let's not waste time. I don't have much time. I'll send the money for the ticket to your card. I'll meet you at the station, then we'll figure it out." The next day, he got off the train and, seeing her at the station, immediately threw himself into his arms. "How glad I am to see you," he said. Mason missed Molly very much. Parting with her seemed like an eternity that would never end. She was glad to see him too. Holding hands, they walked towards the exit and then hailed a cab and arrived at the rented apartment. "Wow. Wow," Mason exclaimed, entering the room. "This is a palace. This place must be worth a lot of money." "From where?" "From a camel," she joked. "Come on, we'll have tea." For several days, Mason could not come to his senses. He lived in a luxurious apartment, which, although located on the outskirts of the capital, but had a beautiful view and Euro renovation. Next to him was his favorite girl. It seemed to him that there was nothing more to desire. But after 3 days, Molly told him that he needed to find a place to live and move in a week. "About why?" he asked in surprise. "Are we not happy here with you? Why do you want me to leave?" You see, this apartment is not mine, and you yourself know it very well. She answered calmly. We can't stay here together because this apartment was bought for me. They did. What do you mean? Bought? I don't understand. Mason, don't be such a baby. You understand everything. This apartment is not mine, but it was bought for me. I'm here. How do I explain this to you? I don't live alone. Well, no, it's not. Shit. I'm so confused. Molly sat down next to him on the couch and took his hand. Mason, what do you think? You know and understand everything yourself. I don't see any reason to fight. I'll give you money for a simple apartment somewhere around here. You get whatever you want. We'll meet there. Now, we've got to get ready, or we might be in an ambiguous situation. 2 days later, he rented a small apartment in the same neighborhood for a fairly modest price. Yes, it's not a palace, but it's livable, he said, taking the keys from the owner. What a bunch of people, the woman exclaimed indignantly. Not a palace for him. Everyone comes here, thinking that there are mountains of gold here. But in reality, life is just like life, just as ordinary, with its advantages and disadvantages. Nothing special. Easy for you to say, Mason replied. You were born in Moscow, and I was born here for the first time. And it's silly to compare salaries. In my hometown, a regular job pays as much as you Muscovites pay. For communal services, a month. All right, that's just a story. Having politely said goodbye, the woman left the apartment. Mason was alone. Molly asked him not to call, said she'd get in touch. But the question was, when he realized that she was in a relationship with another man, but didn't want to think about it.
Deep down, he regretted very much that he had agreed to this adventure. More and more often, he thought that he should have talked her out of it when Molly had the idea. But she had only waved it off and replied that
everyone lived like that. So what? She said. Some girls have been living like this in Moscow for decades, and there are even some who have families, children. And the lover, if you look for two on TV, so that he did not have time for
all sorts of total control and other nonsense, and that he himself is afraid to be exposed like fire. Not every wife would put up with that. It's just intimacy, it's just some animal instinct.
And you're so worried about it, like I'm planning to commit some kind of crime. She really didn't think about the consequences. It wasn't until she came face to face with them that she realized how wrong she'd been. The day after Mason moved in, Molly showed up late at night in her shirt and beaten up. Instead of her face, it was a bloody mess. We agreed you wouldn't cheat on me. That was the main condition of our relationship. He yelled from the doorway. What about you? Or did you think I was so stupid I wouldn't know? You're such a little girl. For God's sake, they met by chance. She was drinking coffee in a very ordinary Moscow cafe, but he couldn't get to his favorite restaurant that day because of traffic jams. So he decided to have lunch wherever he had to because of the large flow of people in the cafe. There were no free tables left. And taking his business lunch, he approached her and asked if he could sit down. Molly nodded when she saw a grown-up and respectable man with a solid gold watch on his hands. The conversation formed on its own. She was greatly surprised to meet such a man in an ordinary diner. Did you happen to be in the wrong diner? She asked wryly. Are you joking? With sadness in his voice, he replied, Yes, I understand. I can see that this place is clearly not to my status, but you understand. Moscow. Traffic. And I have a meeting in an hour. I've got to get around. Molly realized he was in a hurry and didn't impose her company, but before he left, he made it clear he didn't mind getting to know her. There was no ring on his hand. Even if there had been, it wouldn't have made much difference. She hadn't known at the time that anything would happen between them, though she'd thought it would be a good idea to get to know the man. He ordered her a salad and a pastry, then held out his card. "My name is Jacob," said the man. "If you want to meet, write your phone number on the back. I just don't have anything else with me, so, as they say, it's all I have." At this moment, Molly realized that this was her chance, and, taking a pen, which he carefully took out of his jacket pocket, wrote the number. "What time is convenient for you to call?" The question seemed too polite for such a man, but she answered it, then followed him through the cafe window. When he went outside and got into his Bentley, her mind was a mess. Was she really that lucky? It just couldn't be. He'd chosen her for a reason. Molly reminded him painfully of his late wife. The same long blonde hair, the same deep blue eyes that you could stare into forever. She had passed away a year ago. I guess he'd let her do too much, and he was partly responsible for her death. That fateful day, after a nightclub party, she got drunk on her motorcycle. He could have made a difference if he'd gone with her. He could have given her a car and security. But he didn't, because he trusted her like he trusted himself. Despite the significant age difference, and he was a full 25 years older than her, Kusuror. In all their 3 years together, he'd never once caught her cheating. She was so unpredictable. He loved her so much, he couldn't imagine his life without her. He could allow himself any woman he wanted, but he didn't need anyone. When he walked into that stupid cafe and saw Molly, he knew right away that their meeting was no accident. Not for nothing that day in Moscow, there were such traffic jams that it was simply impossible to drive 100 meters through the city center in less than half an hour. A month later, he bought a new apartment in Moscow, where Molly moved and where they met 3 times a week. Jacob said that especially for you. I even picked out a design that suits you. In fact, he had chosen an apartment with a design that his wife liked, but Molly didn't know or even realize it. He preferred not to tell her about his past, nor did he pester her about it. He didn't even know where she came from. The only thing he really wanted was her looks. He just wanted her to be there, almost an exact replica of his late wife, whom he would never see again. The entire house he and Christina lived in was furnished in light blue and green colors. Jacob could have brought her there, but his conscience would not allow him to build a new relationship where he was happy with her and where everything reminded him, sir, of her. I'm not asking for an answer from you right now, but in the future, could you marry me? He asked as they sat on the windowsill one rainy evening drinking wine. Molly was shocked by this question. What's what? She certainly wasn't going to marry him. She had her own goals and plans, and this man was just a tool to realize them. Honestly, I don't know, she answered. I haven't thought about marriage yet. That was the end of the matter. Jacob did not insist. She made sure that he would never bring it up again. As soon as Molly realized that she did not know the need for anything, Jacob gives her so much money that it cannot be counted. She immediately called Mason. He came to Moscow when the lover was on a business trip. Letting him into the apartment, Molly didn't even think about the fact that there might be cameras in it. What did you think? Jacob wouldn't stop yelling. Do I look like the kind of person who would pick up other people's scraps? You're going to cheat on me with your country boy and still live off me? He was out of control. Jacob had never felt such rage. Christina was always being watched too, but he needed it not so much to convict her of cheating, which never happened, but to collect his own video equipment. With those videos, he could control her even if she ever decided to leave him. He just wouldn't let her do it, because if such a thing happened, he'd put every last frame of it on the internet. Do you suffer from frostbite like you? Said his partner from Europe, with whom they had dinner together in France during a romantic trip within their wives. I, for one, don't need all this for nothing. Young and beautiful women in Moscow in bulk with my money at my feet in a minute will be any woman I wish. Why should I hang cameras all over the house? Well, we'll go to the left. We'll be penniless, and we'll return to his backwoods in his underwear. And I'll have another one in a week. But Jacob couldn't do that. He only preferred women of a certain type. And it was not only in appearance, but also in something elusive, inexplicable, that only he felt alone. It was something no one else could understand. That night, he beat her as hard as he could, and at a certain point, he was so out of control that he began to strangle her. Molly was lucky that before he did that, he had thrown her on the bed with a large vase on the nightstand, which she used to hit him over the head. She didn't even have time to get dressed. She quickly ran out of the apartment and rushed to Mason's apartment. Upon seeing Molly, the young man was in shock. "What happened?" he asked. "Can't you see for yourself?" She snapped at him and went into the room and fell on the bed. She wondered how, after such a severe beating, she had the strength to run almost a whole block. Mason brought alcohol and ointment to treat Molly's wounds, after which she drank a mug of strong tea and promptly fell asleep. The next morning, a difficult conversation took place between them. "As you realize, we have nothing else to pay for this apartment," she said. "That means that in a month, we will have to leave here. I'm not going back to the middle of nowhere. Molly, please," he said, looking at her piteously. "Let's go." "To hell with Moscow." "I have an apartment, we'll get married, we'll work. Everything will be fine with us. Yeah, sure. Living in a Khrushchevka apartment all your life. Yes, eating pasta, but no, I don't agree to that. I didn't just come here to move back for some asshole. So what if he's a gentle psycho? I'll find a guy who doesn't care who I sleep with but him. I'm sure there's plenty of them out there. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm sorry, Molly. After all this, you have to realize you can't go overboard like that. You see where this kind of venture leads. And it would be half a miracle if you'd never experienced it, but you've experienced it firsthand. What if they don't find you tomorrow? Have you thought about that? Oh, please, don't be afraid of the wolf. And you, if you're so right, then get out of here. And if you're so right, you go straight to the bushes. And when you smell money, you're right there. And you think I'm some naive shepherdess who doesn't know what I am? You're just like everybody else. No better. The whole thing went so fast that Molly didn't even realize it. When she finally came to her senses, Mason was gone, and she got a job and rented a room. From this day forward, we're going our separate ways, she said, as she walked him to the train station. Thank you again for helping me, for not leaving me in a difficult situation. I'll never forget it. Maybe you'll stay after all? He asked. Mason didn't expect to hear a positive answer. He didn't. He kept thinking about her on the way home, and he knew he would never leave her in the lurch, no matter what happened. But he couldn't take part in her adventures anymore either. When he arrived in the city, he got a job, and for almost 8 months he never called Molly. But that didn't stop her from being the closest person to him. He thought of her every day, every minute when he had the chance. She drew an uncomplicated parallel that seemed too banal, but it was still funny. Jacob she had met in a cafe while drinking coffee, and James too, not in the same way, but still in a cafe. Once, immersed in her thoughts, she even jokingly thought, apparently, this is my destiny. To meet men in Moscow cafes, attracting them or something. She had no love for James either, but as soon as she met him, she knew he was the best option for her. A young man from a wealthy family was just what she needed. She had no idea what was in store for her at the time, nor that she would repeat her mistake. Only this time, fate would not treat her so cruelly. On the table, there were still pictures of her without clothes, familiar surroundings. She immediately guessed where the pictures were from. No one but him could have posted them on the websites where Nancy and the detective Nancy had hired had found them. But those pictures didn't bother her at all. She didn't seriously think James would be upset by this vulgarity. It ran through her head, even if he was upset, he wouldn't divorce her. There was always an explanation, especially since Molly had one in this situation, and she was interested in something else entirely. Looking at Nancy, Molly was amazed at how naive it was. Couldn't her praised detective have gotten such valuable information? It was easier to look for what was outside one's own bedroom than to find out about what was going on literally under one's nose. This embarrassed and amused Molly at the same time. Their conversation was interrupted at the point where they both heard the keyhole rattle, a few. Seconds later, James entered the apartment. Molly didn't even attempt to remove the pictures from the table. Nancy did. When James went into the bathroom to wash his hands, she quietly said, "I won't show him those pictures if you leave him on your own. Your choice. Either you fly from our house in disgrace and go back to your darkness of cockroaches. Where will you spend the rest of your life with no money and no prospects? And a baby in your arms, Or you yourself divorce my son under any pretext, and I'll give you a good payoff. But what about the baby? I don't know. How far along are you? Well, if I'm not too far along, I can help you with that. But if you're past your due date, then have the baby. What else can I say? Go on TV and look for your daddy who got you pregnant. Live on child support. Do whatever you want. Anyway, our family, my son, it shouldn't concern us." Molly looked at her carefully and wondered again if she could think in her head that she would so easily agree to get rid of a hen who would lay golden eggs in the long run. She couldn't even imagine who was sitting in her belly. Molly had only recently found out about it herself. "Mom, do you happen to know where Molly is?" asked James the next morning, when he woke up and did not find not only his wife in the room, but also her things. He was very surprised and couldn't believe his eyes at first. Maybe something had happened to his grandmother and she needed to leave urgently, he thought to himself, trying to call Molly. But no one picked up. "No, I don't know." "What's wrong, son?" Nancy tried to make a surprised look on her face, but she didn't do it very well. She lived in the room closest to the door, and she heard Castle shriek at Sororiosio. She didn't go out into the hallway to see who had left the apartment. She already knew that. Now she had to hide her joy from her son and from her husband, for both were asking her where Molly might have disappeared to. "Why are you so curious all of a sudden?" The woman was surprised that her husband was the first to ask about Molly. "Why do you care?" "Well, maybe she's gone somewhere." He was interested, and she had no idea how strong. Molly didn't do it because she was afraid Nancy would show James the photos. She didn't give a damn about her husband. The girl seriously feared for the future child. There was no telling what that crazy woman would think when she found out the truth. Nancy is an unpredictable person, and people like her are capable of anything. And suddenly, after talking to her, Molly felt fear not so much for herself as for the baby. She found no better option but to return to her town. On the way, she thought about what she would say to Miranda. She had to explain herself to her grandmother, because it would be impossible to hide the truth from her now. "How could it be?" she asked, not hiding her surprise. "Why did you do it? Do you realize that you ruined your own life? Everything was going so well. If you had lived honorably and conscientiously with James, you would never have found yourself in such a terrible situation." Miranda didn't judge her granddaughter. The wise woman understood that Molly had inherited from her mother, if not all, then some. Not the best features. Genes are stubborn things, and it is not so easy to overcome them. And given that Molly had never even tried to do that, the outcome was obvious. "Okay, you go to bed, sleep, get some rest from the road," she said. "Wraps a blanket around Molly. We'll figure something out." Don't worry, Molly wasn't worried about the baby. The most important thing for her was that it was born. After that, she would be able to claim the apartment, the monthly maintenance, and all the things she had longed for. Looking at her phone screen, she saw over 20 missed calls. It was James, who had been dialing the same number unsuccessfully since this morning. "As soon as he got the chance, you better call him back. Tell him you're away." Miranda was convinced that it was for the best. She could hear the vibrations of the phone by. Molly was asleep but hesitated to pick up the phone without her knowing. Or let me pick up the phone and tell him he can go to the police if he thinks you're missing. He has a right to, after all. He is your husband. Yeah, I guess you're right, said the girl. Next time he calls, you pick up the phone and tell him everything. I can't talk to him. Lotroy. She remembered how she had left the Moscow apartment in tears. She was so reluctant to leave, she had long since gotten used to provincial life and had forgotten what it was like. And to go out of the house and see near the entrance on the bench local alcachés, who every now and then collect and retell each other gossip about their neighbors. But there was nothing she could do. She was going to spend the next few months here, and in her situation, it was the only reasonable way out. I talked to him, I told Miranda, I said, I don't know what happened there, but you came to me early in the morning, all crying and tired. He said he didn't understand what was going on. I mean, everything was fine yesterday. Look, you should have told him not to be under any false illusions. You're seeing him anyway. And when he finds out, there's no telling what will happen. You'll do anything, Molly replied. How can you talk about something like that? It's not human. And secondly, please don't forget that it's not just about him. Miranda remembered this as well as anyone and understood everything. But now, everything that had happened up to this point made absolutely no sense. The most important thing was the baby, and that it was born healthy. A few days after the arrival, Molly met Mason by chance on the street. She didn't expect they'd ever see each other again. She couldn't even understand how she felt about him now. He was still her friend. She felt very good about him, and she needed his support. So she decided not to pass by, but to walk over and talk. Hi, she said lakeward, of the familiar young man by the sleeve, hoping she didn't need to introduce herself. He looked at her strangely, which made Molly very scared. She suddenly thought about the fact that he wouldn't even want to talk to her. And yet so much had happened between them. He could have taken offense, met another girl, eventually even gotten married. In the time they've been apart, his life could have changed completely. And then she walks up to him on the street, yanking him back so and so carelessly, and tries to talk to him. Come on. After the slight stupor he had suddenly fallen into after seeing Molly, Mason couldn't say anything else. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? While they were walking home, she told him how her life in Moscow had turned out after his departure. Mason listened attentively and held her hand the whole time. He had not forgotten about her for a moment. Molly, let's get married, he suggested. Just like that. Casually, in between. What are you going to do alone with the baby? He needs a father, so I'll sign him over to me at the hospital. If we get married, no one will even ask anything. They usually don't ask anything, she said. But no, Mason, no. I have my own plans for this child and my own goals. Thank you for the offer, of course, but I'll decline. Mason guessed what she was up to and realized that she hadn't changed a bit since the last time they'd seen each other. But it had no effect on his attitude toward her. For 7 months, he came to visit her regularly and gave her gifts. They went for walks together and talked about everything. Neighbors looked at them as a married couple, and many thought they were actually husband and wife. Well, you're Molly. I see she's all grown up. She's married now. Asked by local acquaintances whenever they met Miranda in the entrance or on the street, she answered their questions evasively and tried to end the conversation as quickly as possible. But this was not always possible. What are you expecting? A son or a daughter? She heard such questions herself. It was quite often. In response, she always tried to smile, but on Molly's soul, the cat squeaked. The last few weeks before giving birth were the most difficult of her life. Even years later, she would look back on that difficult time. Like the fact that on the day she was discharged from the birth center, she was in for a surprise she couldn't even think of. Molly was sure that she would solve this issue much later, but fate ordered in such a way that everything happened by itself. It was discharge day. Well, you're finally discharged. Miranda welcomed Molly home with Mason. What a beautiful baby girl. Our Lisa. The woman looked at the baby with tenderness and warmth. Molly and Mason looked at each other happily. In a couple of weeks, she planned to inform the present father that he had a daughter and demand a payoff from him. In the situation, Molly realized she could ask for any amount of money she wanted, and he would get her from under the ground. But as she turned away from her newborn daughter, who was being held in the arms of her loving grandmother, she saw him. "You," she said. "What are you doing here? I've come to talk to you." The man answered calmly, "Don't worry so much about getting nervous. Let's step aside and discuss everything like civilized adults." Molly nodded to Miranda and walked away with him into the nearby forest park. Mason offered to accompany her, but Molly flatly refused. "No, it's unnecessary," she said. "He won't do anything to me. We'll just talk, and I'll walk home on my own. You two go on ahead, and Grandma, you can handle Lisa while I'm gone." "Of course I can, can't I? It's not the first time." Seated on the bench, Molly stared at the man who had something very important to tell her. Strangely enough, she was not only willing to listen to him, but she was waiting for him to start the conversation first. "I think we have a pretty little girl," he said. "Who does she look like?" "You or me?" "Me," Molly replied. Dryly. "Okay, let's leave the lyrics and talk business." "Yeah, that's why I'm here. Until you came here and made a scene, I couldn't let that happen. That's why I'm here. Let me get this straight. How much do you want to forget about me and my family forever?" That there would be a connection between them, Molly realized from the very first day, as soon as she crossed the threshold of the James house, and only waited for the moment when he hinted or suggested for her, in this state of affairs himself. It was nothing special. She liked Charles even better than she liked his son. Oh, and all the money in the family belonged to him, too. Nancy had certainly accomplished a lot in life, but had only a mediocre and barely funny voice compared to the head of the family, who always had the last word. Charles had been cheating on his wife for a long time. Nancy hadn't been attracted to young female students who were willing to do anything for positive grades, connections, and protection for a long time. Nor had he ever had strong feelings for her in his younger years. She wasn't the most beautiful woman he'd ever been close to. That's why she became his wife. He had always categorized women and thought it was not only perfectly normal, but the right thing to do. When James brought Molly into the house, Charles realized that for the first time in a long time, he had the opportunity to combine pleasure with utility. And most importantly, there was no need to buy gifts, flowers, and be even a little bit gallant and courteous. He hated to build himself a gentleman, but he had to do it at least at the first stages of communication with another young girl. Otherwise, he wouldn't get what he wanted. "I see you're a smart girl," he began the conversation, of everyone across from Molly. No one was home in the kitchen that day. Nancy was away on business at a friend's house, and James was staying late at the institute. It was the perfect moment to have a heart-to-heart talk with Molly. "Do you want to marry the public?" he continued. "Look, I can arrange it for you. A life in Moscow. I can even help you with your studies, or a job. Whatever you want anyway. But on one condition, Molly knew what he was getting at. But she was very interested in how he would offer it to her. Even for such a cynical, calculating girl as she was, such a tone and lack of ceremony was a big overkill. But she didn't show it, and continued to listen to him. "Will you marry him?" said Charles,
I promise you that. But you will sleep with me. Molly looked at him carefully and tried to look surprised and embarrassed, but he quickly recognized her and,
After a moment's silence, continued, "Don't make that insulted face like I'm offering you something humiliating. I can see right through you. Or do you think I'm a naive young fool like James, when even at his age I wasn't that stupid? All right, that's just a lyric. What do you say?" "I have to think about it," Molly said, and went to her room. The very next night, she quietly got out of bed so as not to wake her husband, tiptoed into his room. Upon seeing her, Charles froze with surprise. "Consider it a deal," she said in a whisper. "I think it's perfect. Everyone sleeps like a dead man at night. You and your wife don't live in the same room, so I can come here quietly and then leave just as quietly. But we'll behave like mice. We mustn't let anyone overhear or guess anything." The very next day, he gave his consent to Molly and James's wedding. They met in secret for several months, and after another night spent together, they had breakfast with their spouses at the common table as if nothing had happened. This continued until one day Molly said, "In a few months, we will have to temporarily end our relationship." "Why? What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm expecting a baby." "You're not little, you must understand." He didn't take her words seriously at the time, and she didn't know exactly who the child was from. Only when the doctor told her the exact date, Molly realized that the father was Charles. At that time, James was too tired at school, was constantly busy with his work, and in the evening fell into bed without energy. Molly only had a relationship with Charles, and there was no doubt that he was the father of the child. "It's your baby," she said when she went to see him the next night after going to counseling. "Are you sure?" When he heard the news, he was wary, even tense, because he realized that this girl now had leverage over him. And if ever the moment came that she would press it, he could lose not only his family, but also half of what he had earned in his life, including bribes from students. Charles was a very cunning man and made money wherever he could. For him, there was no such thing as dishonest money. The main thing was that no one knew about it, and you could do anything. He lived with this position since his early youth and did not change it even when he grew up. "So how much do you want?"
He repeated the question, looking at Molly, who was sitting on a bench, breathing fresh air. In that moment, he wished he had asked her that back when she had told him she was expecting his child. It was possible to solve the problems in a different way then. You realize my wife can't know about this. I ask you very much. Let's settle the matter like adequate people and part without mutual claims to each other. She took a piece of paper out of her
Pocket and showed him the amount she had written on it, after which she lit it with a lighter and walked away from the park. On the same piece of paper was the address where he was to bring the money, Mason. "I'm going to need your help tomorrow," Molly said when she got home. "Can you go with me to a place?" "Yeah, sure." "Where to, if it's no secret?" he asked. "I'll tell you later." "Yekoma Yuri, you can babysit Lisa, and Mason and I have to go away for a while tomorrow. But we'll be back in no time." "Of course I will." "What are we talking about?" Molly responded excitedly. When she saw her granddaughter carrying a huge bag of money, she freaked out. "Jesus, Molly, where did that come from? Have you robbed someone?" "Ask it the worried woman." "No, don't worry. It's all hard-earned money." Molly joked. After a few days, Miranda figured out where Molly got the money from and approved of what she had done. "If he's such a jerk," she said, "then let him pay." "Come on." He doesn't want his wife to find out. If he doesn't want her to know, he'll have to pay. Molly realized that with relatively modest expenses and full budgeting, she could have enough money to last a lifetime. 6 months later, she and Mason built a big house, where they moved with the whole family. Mason went to study to become a computer programmer, and Molly began to study foreign languages. Charles, after meeting Molly, returned to Moscow, where he continued to live with Nancy as if nothing had happened. They still rarely spoke and slept in separate rooms, but such a life suited him completely. Molly kept her word, and Nancy never knew that there was any connection between them. James couldn't help himself, though, remembering in great detail Molly's story of his childhood. He'd gone to her town and used the street description to find the house where she'd lived. But the neighbors on the bench said that Molly had moved away a few months ago with her husband, child, and mother.
After these words, James had no choice but to return home. A few weeks after that trip, he found a notice of dissolution of marriage in the mailbox. When little Lisa turned 1 year old, Molly and Mason organized a solemn wedding,
Where they invited all the orphanage, their friends and acquaintances. Molly did not remember about her past life. She was happy enough and had nothing else to be happy about.